in the sweltering, unforgiving heat of a Roman summer in 1503, a pall of death hung heavy over the Eternal City. Two of the era's most formidable figures, Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare Borgia, lay consumed by agony, their powerful bodies racked with a mysterious, debilitating fever. As their cries echoed faintly through the ancient, hallowed halls of the Vatican, whispers slithered like vipers through the cloistered corridors. Was this truly divine retribution, a righteous judgment for their notorious excesses? Had they, the masters of poison, finally succumbed to their own dark arts? Or were they simply, tragically, casualties of Rome's notoriously deadly summer malaria, a silent reaper that cared nothing for papal crowns or ducal titles? The definitive truth, shrouded in the humid Roman air, would perish with them, sealed away forever. Yet, their legend, a tapestry woven with threads of scandal, ambition, and unspeakable cruelty, would ignite and blaze through history. Welcome, then, to the saga of the Borgias, a name that became, for centuries, an inescapable synonym for corruption, murder, and the most labyrinthine, darkest secrets ever harbored within the sacred precincts of the Vatican. This is the harrowing tale of how a relatively modest Spanish noble family, through sheer audacity and ruthless cunning, clawed its way to the absolute pinnacle of power in Renaissance Europe, leaving in its wake a horrifying trail of bodies, monumental scandals, and enigmatic mysteries that continue to confound and fascinate historians even 5 centuries later. Before we plunge headlong into this intoxicating abyss of poison chalices and notorious papal orgies, I urge you, hit that subscribe button and switch on your notifications. Trust me when I say, what you are about to unearth regarding the raw mechanics of papal power, the brutal realities of Renaissance politics, and the terrifyingly refined art of strategic murder will utterly dismantle and reshape everything you thought you knew about the venerable Catholic Church. You won't want to miss a single shocking second of this unfolding drama. And here's what truly elevates this story beyond mere historical intrigue. The Borgias didn't just exert an unparalleled influence on their own tumultuous epoch. Their audacious methods, their breathtaking scandals, and their meteoric, blood-stained ascent to power forged a chilling template, a blueprint whose echoes resonate disturbingly through the corridors of modern politics even today. Once you grasp the intricate web of their operations, you'll begin to recognize their unmistakable fingerprints on power structures and ruthless strategies that permeate our contemporary world. This is not merely dusty, ancient history. It is an immersive masterclass in the unvarnished truth of how power genuinely functions. So, brace yourselves and buckle up, because we are about to journey back to a visceral era when the Pope commanded not just spiritual dominion but vast armies, when cardinals openly kept mistresses in sumptuous Roman palaces, and when a seemingly unassuming Spanish family, the Borgias, would meticulously transform themselves into the infamous Borgias, coming perilously close to conquering and dominating all of Italy. This is their definitive story, and it commences not amidst the cool, opulent marble halls of the Vatican, but in a small, provincial Spanish town that most people have never even heard of. The year is 1378, and within the sun-drenched, fertile kingdom of Valencia, nestled in a modest, unremarkable town known as Jativa, a child is born. This infant, Alonso de Borja, would one day, against all conceivable odds, fundamentally reshape the Catholic Church forever. He hails from a family of middling nobility, respectable but far from illustrious. Nothing about his birth, no celestial omens, no pronouncements of destiny, suggests that he is marked for greatness. The Borgias are, by all accounts, a family of solid, respectable citizens, but utterly unremarkable. They are the kind of family that might produce a successful merchant, perhaps a diligent local official, but most certainly not, by any stretch of the imagination, a pope. But it is precisely here, in the humble origins of Alonso de Borja, that the Borgia story truly ignites, for it unveils a fundamental, often brutal, truth about the very nature of power in medieval Europe. Social mobility, the ability to ascend beyond one's birthright, was indeed possible, a rare and arduous feat, yet it demanded not merely ambition, but 3 extraordinary, indispensable qualities. First, a relentless, almost monstrous ambition, unburdened by conventional morality. Second, a strategic intelligence so sharp it could cut through the most intricate political knots. And third, an almost supernatural, chilling ability to read, understand, and then skillfully manipulate the hearts and minds of others. The Borgias, as history would dramatically prove, possessed all three of these qualities in terrifying abundance. Alonso's extraordinary path to power, therefore, began not on battlefields or in royal courts, but within the quiet confines of an academic institution, his rigorous education. In an age where most nobles considered intellectual pursuits beneath their martial dignity, viewing scholarly endeavors as fit only for clerks or cloistered monks, the Borgia family made an uncharacteristic, yet profoundly strategic, investment in their children's intellectual development. Young Alonso, a keen and brilliant mind, immersed himself in the study of law at the prestigious University of Leyde. There, he didn't just merely learn. He meticulously mastered the incredibly complex legal frameworks that governed both secular and ecclesiastical power, dissecting every intricate nuance, every loophole, every leverage point. This was far more than a mere academic exercise. For Alonso, it was an intensive, strategic reconnaissance mission. The young, ambitious Alfonso wasn't just studying. He was meticulously mapping the very system he intended, with chilling precision, to conquer. By the time he reached his 30s, Alonso had already established himself as one of Spain's most skilled and formidable canon lawyers, his reputation preceding him. He had forged a formidable image characterized by an ironclad discretion, an undeniable competence, and an uncanny, almost preternatural ability to navigate the treacherous, often lethal, waters of church politics. When the cataclysmic Western Schism erupted, tearing the very fabric of the Catholic Church apart with multiple competing popes vehemently claiming divine legitimacy, Alonso, with masterful foresight, positioned himself not as a partisan, but as the perfect, indispensable mediator. He didn't merely choose a side in the tumultuous conflict. He engineered himself into a position where he became absolutely vital to all sides, a neutral, brilliant negotiator whose insights and skills were sought by every faction. His breakthrough, the pivotal moment that irrevocably set him on his ascent, came when he strategically lent his crucial support to the eventual victor in the protracted papal struggle, Pope Martin v. Gratitude. In the cynical, transactional world of medieval politics, was a currency often far more valuable and enduring than mere gold, and Alonso had just made an enormous, calculated deposit into the coffers of papal favor. In 1429, his unwavering loyalty and invaluable service were amply rewarded with the coveted cardinal's hat, a potent symbol of immense power and prestige within the Church. Yet, this monumental achievement, the cardinal's hat, was merely the opening gambit, the very first move in a grander, generational chess match. Cardinal Alonso de Borja, now ensconced within the highest echelons of the Church, dedicated the next 2 relentless decades of his life to meticulously constructing an international network of influence so vast and intricate that it would undoubtedly make even the most seasoned modern lobbyists weep with envy. He assiduously cultivated relationships with an astonishing array of powerful figures. Kings who held sway over nations, wealthy merchants whose fortunes fueled empires, and fellow cardinals who held the keys to the Vatican's most guarded secrets. With each handshake, each whispered confidence, he learned their deepest secrets, their most crippling weaknesses, their insatiable desires. And most importantly, with every strategic connection forged, he began the systematic elevation of other members of his burgeoning family, skillfully drawing them into his ever-expanding sphere of influence and patronage. The Borgia family's overarching strategy was breathtaking in its sheer brilliance and terrifying simplicity. They didn't merely seek power for a single individual, a fleeting moment of glory. No, their vision was far grander. They meticulously set about building an enduring dynasty, a multi-generational legacy of absolute dominion. Alonso, the patriarch, carefully orchestrated his intelligent nephew Rodrigo's education, ensuring he received instruction from the finest universities and tutors of the age. He relentlessly secured lucrative and influential positions for numerous other family members throughout the vast, intricate hierarchy of the church, embedding them like meticulously placed pawns across a colossal chessboard. They were, in essence, creating what we might readily recognize today as a sophisticated political machine, albeit one operating with chilling efficiency within the ancient, hallowed, and often corrupt structures of medieval Christianity. Then, in the momentous year of 1455, something truly extraordinary, something almost miraculous transpired. Pope Nicholas V, the reigning pontiff, passed away, and the College of Cardinals, the elite body charged with electing his successor, found themselves plunged into an intractable deadlock. The leading candidates, powerful and ambitious men though they were, had accumulated too many formidable enemies to secure the necessary vote. The compromised, less controversial candidates, for their part, simply lacked sufficient widespread support to break the impasse. It was into this swirling, desperate vacuum of indecision and political paralysis that the cunning Spanish Cardinal Alonso de Borja, who had spent decades positioning himself as the pragmatic, acceptable second choice to almost everyone, shrewdly stepped forward. With a blend of calculated diplomacy and quiet maneuvering, Alonso de Borja was elected pope, adopting the venerable name Calixtus III. The first Spanish pope in history had just been crowned, a harbinger of seismic shifts, and with his ascension, the audacious, infamous Borgia age was about to commence, irrevocably altering the course of European history. Pope Calixtus III was a man of advanced years, 77 years old, when he ascended to the papal throne, a venerable age by 15th-century standards. Consequently, many within the College of Cardinals and throughout Europe expected him to be nothing more than a docile caretaker pope, a harmless, elderly man who would simply keep the papal seat warm for a few quiet years, perhaps ushering in an era of peace before gracefully dying in his sleep. They could not, in their wildest imaginings, have been more profoundly mistaken. Calixtus, despite his age, brought to the papacy the very same cold, methodical, and utterly ruthless approach that had propelled him from his relatively provincial Spanish nobility to the highest, most sacred office in all of Christendom. His absolute first priority, pursued with unwavering intensity, was the consolidation of power, and he achieved this through the time-honored, albeit often scandalous, tradition of nepotism. However, Calixtus didn't just practice nepotism. He elevated it, with a chilling efficiency, to an art form, a systematic instrument of dynastic expansion. His most audacious and significant appointment was the immediate elevation of his brilliant nephew, Rodrigo, to the rank of cardinal at the impossibly young age of 25. This was no mere act of doting favoritism, no simple indulgence of family ties. This was strategic planning of the highest order, a calculated investment on a generational scale. Rodrigo Borja was, even then, demonstrably brilliant, possessed an almost irresistible charm, and was already utterly, chillingly ruthless. Crucially, he was young enough to not only inherit his uncle's burgeoning power, but to build upon that formidable foundation for many decades to come, ensuring the family's long-term dominance. Calixtus did not stop there. He proceeded with a systematic, almost surgical precision, placing Borgia family members and their carefully selected allies in virtually every key position throughout the vast, intricate hierarchy of the Church. He didn't just tweak. He radically restructured Vatican finances, meticulously diverting their immense resources to directly benefit his family's burgeoning interests. He initiated what would, tragically, become a notorious Borgia tradition, treating the immense papal treasury as if it were nothing more than a personal family piggy bank, to be plundered at will. Perhaps most significantly, Calixtus initiated the radical transformation of the Borgia family itself, from merely ambitious Spanish nobility seeking influence to formidable, entrenched Italian power brokers. He began purchasing vast estates, sprawling tracts of land around Rome, solidifying their territorial presence. He commissioned magnificent palaces and breathtaking artistic works, not merely for aesthetic pleasure, but to aggressively establish the family's cultural legitimacy and demonstrate their arrival as undisputed patrons of the Renaissance. He was, quite literally and brazenly, buying his family's way into the ancient, exclusive Italian aristocracy. The other cardinals, a collection of venerable Italian families themselves, watched this systematic, audacious takeover with a growing, palpable alarm and simmering resentment. But they had tragically underestimated the shrewd, steely resolve of the old Spanish pope. Calixtus had dedicated his entire career to the meticulous study of power, and he understood a profound, cynical truth that his critics, steeped in tradition, entirely missed. In the cutthroat, brutal world of Renaissance politics, audacious, daring moves were often rewarded far more handsomely than cautious restraint. The bolder your strategies, the more aggressively you moved, the more your enemies would, ironically, assume you possessed even more dangerous, unplayed cards up your sleeve, paralyzing them with fear and uncertainty. Calixtus III ruled for a mere 3 years, passing away in 1458. But those 3 years, brief as they were, proved more than sufficient to establish the unshakable foundation for everything that would catastrophically follow. When he finally died, the Borgia family was no longer a scattered collection of Spanish provincials desperately trying to make their way in the convoluted labyrinth of Italian politics. They had transformed into a formidable, undeniable force to be reckoned with, and the young, brilliantly ruthless Rodrigo was perfectly positioned to continue, and indeed accelerate, the family's relentless ascent. The other cardinals, perhaps with a sigh of relief, genuinely believed they had witnessed the end of the tenacious Borgia influence. Instead, with a chilling irony, they had merely borne witness to the curtain rising on the opening act of what would become the most scandalous, most infamous, and most enduring dynasty in the entire tumultuous history of the Vatican. The death of Pope Calixtus III in 1458, far from being a moment of unbridled triumph, instead presented the ambitious Borgia family with their first truly major crisis. The newly elected Pope, Pius II, was openly, even vehemently, hostile to the encroaching Spanish influence that Calixtus had so aggressively cultivated within the Vatican. Consequently, many of the hard-won positions, lavish privileges, and vast wealth that Calixtus had painstakingly secured for his family were systematically stripped away. Lesser families, encountering such a monumental setback, would likely have retreated ignominiously to their Spanish estates, their brief, ill-fated Italian adventure brought to a humiliating end. But Rodrigo Borgia was emphatically not from a lesser family. At the tender age of 27, Cardinal Rodrigo found himself in an undeniably precarious, yet ultimately defining, position. He was perceived as too young, too foreign, and too recently elevated to command immediate, genuine respect from the entrenched, powerful Italian cardinals who dominated the college. While his family's wealth was certainly substantial, it was not yet overwhelming, and his burgeoning political network, though impressive for his age, was still very much in its formative stages. A conventional politician, faced with such daunting circumstances, might have cautiously focused on slowly and patiently building alliances, carefully avoiding controversy while gradually accumulating influence through years of quiet diplomacy. Rodrigo, however, chose a radically different, far more audacious path entirely. He made a deliberate, strategic decision to become absolutely indispensable. While other cardinals meticulously focused on intricate theological debates or the labyrinthine complexities of interstate politics, Rodrigo, with his keen intellect and profound understanding of human nature, dedicated himself to mastering the art of being profoundly useful to everyone, regardless of their allegiances. He transformed himself into the Vatican's premier problem solver, the go-to man who possessed an almost magical ability to arrange strategically vital, albeit often scandalous, marriages between bitter rival families, to deftly negotiate fragile truces between warring Italian city-states, and to consistently devise creative, often unorthodox, solutions to the Church's chronic, seemingly insurmountable financial difficulties. More profoundly, Rodrigo possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of a fundamental truth about human nature, an insight that would serve him with terrifying efficacy throughout his entire scandalous career. People, he recognized, would forgive almost anything, overlook almost any moral failing or transgression, in someone who consistently made their lives undeniably easier and more prosperous. His charm was not merely legendary, it was a potent, almost hypnotic force. His parties, legendary for their opulence and extravagance, were the talk of Rome, drawing in allies and rivals alike. And his uncanny ability to remember the most minute, personal details about virtually everyone he encountered was a masterful psychological tool, making each individual feel uniquely valued and understood. Cardinals who privately disapproved of his openly dissolute lifestyle found themselves, often grudgingly, relying on his unparalleled expertise and pragmatic solutions. Bishops who publicly questioned his morals discovered, to their astonishment, that only Rodrigo possessed the rare ingenuity and decisive action required to resolve the intractable problems they themselves could not handle. But perhaps most significantly, during this crucible of his early career, Rodrigo began meticulously developing the deeply personal, often compromising, relationships that would ultimately define his notorious legacy. He was appointed Vice-Chancellor of the Holy Roman Church, an incredibly powerful position that granted him unprecedented access to the most intimate secrets of papal justice, the vast, intricate network of papal finances, and the inner workings of the Vatican's entire administrative apparatus. He leveraged this unparalleled access not just to enrich his family and himself, though he certainly did that with breathtaking efficiency, but, far more strategically, to construct a comprehensive, Europe-wide intelligence network, a web of informants and spies that stretched across the entire continent, feeding him invaluable information about every major player and every hidden vulnerability. Now, what Rodrigo did next, the sheer audacity of his actions, would undoubtedly shock even the most jaded Renaissance observer, a society already hardened by pervasive corruption and political intrigue. If you mistakenly believe that modern politicians are the epitome of venality, then prepare yourselves, because what this cardinal orchestrated will redefine your understanding of corruption entirely. Drop a comment below, I challenge you, with your prediction. How do you think Rodrigo Borgia, the charismatic, scandalous, and utterly ruthless cardinal, ultimately became pope? Because I promise you, the truth is infinitely wilder, more Machiavellian, and more astonishing than anything you could possibly imagine. By the vibrant, tumultuous 1470s, Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia had, through sheer force of will, unparalleled cunning, and an almost limitless capacity for opportunism, already solidified his position as one of the most powerful, influential, and indeed, wealthiest men in all of Rome. Despite the fact that he had never, at this point, held the ultimate office of the papacy, he commanded magnificent palaces that rivaled the grandest residences of royalty, maintained a notoriously lavish lifestyle that openly challenged the sumptuary laws and moral expectations of the Church, and had, through various illicit means, accumulated personal wealth that exceeded the entire treasuries of many lesser European kingdoms. Yet, all of this immense power, breathtaking opulence, and strategic networking was, in his calculating mind, merely a preparatory phase, an elaborate prelude to the ultimate prize. The Borgias had learned, internalized, and perfected the most crucial lesson in the brutal, transactional world of Renaissance politics. True power wasn't solely about holding a specific office or title, however lofty. It was, more fundamentally, about meticulously making yourself so utterly indispensable, so profoundly valuable to others, that your rivals and potential enemies simply could not afford, either financially or politically, to oppose you without risking their own ruin. And Rodrigo, with his decades of relentless preparation, was now poised to put this chilling lesson to the ultimate, most audacious test of his life. Indeed, throughout the tumultuous decades of the 1470s and 1480s, Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia embarked upon a deliberate, calculated campaign to transform himself into something truly unprecedented, something utterly unique in the entire venerable history of the Vatican. He became, simultaneously, the papal candidate who was undeniably the most qualified in terms of administrative experience and political acumen, and yet, paradoxically, the most scandalous man residing in Rome. This wasn't some accidental byproduct of a dissolute life. No, this was a meticulously calculated strategy, executed with a level of strategic genius that would have elicited admiring nods from Machiavelli himself, decades before the Florentine even penned his infamous treatise. Though officially bound by the sacred vow of celibacy, Rodrigo Borja, much like a distressing number of other cardinals of his era, maintained only the thinnest veneer of chastity, openly conducting numerous, notorious relationships with some of Rome's most beautiful and influential women. His most significant and enduring liaison was with the captivating Venanza de Catanii, a stunning and sharp-witted courtesan who bore him 4 children, all of whom Rodrigo openly acknowledged and cherished: Juan, the boisterous firstborn; Cesare, the brilliant and terrifyingly ambitious second son; Lucrezia, the famously beautiful daughter; and the youngest, Geoffrey. Yet, here's what truly distinguished Rodrigo from the vast majority of other corrupt, hypocritical clergy members who quietly flouted their vows. He didn't attempt to hide these scandalous relationships in the shadows. On the contrary, he brazenly celebrated them, flaunting his children and their mother with an almost defiant pride. This was not mere recklessness, nor simple indiscretion. This was, in essence, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, meticulously designed to project an image of unassailable power. By openly flaunting behavior that others felt compelled to conceal in shame or fear, Rodrigo was unequivocally demonstrating his unique status and authority to all of Rome. He was, in effect, proclaiming that he was untouchable, that the normal, sacred rules and moral strictures simply did not, and could not, apply to him. And paradoxically, this very defiance of convention, this brazen demonstration of impunity, made him more attractive and awe-inspiring to the very people, from nobles to commoners, who, by all rights, should have been utterly scandalized and repulsed by his conduct. Rodrigo profoundly understood that in the ruthlessly pragmatic, power-obsessed society of Renaissance Italy, people respected raw, tangible power far more than they revered abstract piety or conventional morality. A cardinal who could openly maintain a string of mistresses, publicly acknowledge and legitimize his bastard children, and still ascend the ranks was, in the eyes of his contemporaries, a cardinal who clearly possessed resources, connections, and an audacious impunity that transcended normal ecclesiastical authority. He wasn't just breaking the rules. He was advertising his extraordinary ability to shatter them with absolute impunity, daring anyone to challenge him. But Rodrigo's true, insidious genius lay in how he masterfully leveraged these seemingly scandalous personal relationships to accumulate vast amounts of political capital. His children weren't merely offspring, they were meticulously groomed, strategic assets in his grand dynastic scheme. Juan was carefully nurtured to become a military commander, destined for martial glory. Cesare, even from childhood, was relentlessly groomed for powerful church leadership, a rapid ascent through the ecclesiastical rank. Lucrezia, renowned for her beauty and charm, was strategically positioned as a diplomatic tool, her marriages meticulously arranged to forge crucial alliances with powerful Italian families and secure territorial gains. Even young Geoffrey, the youngest, had his preordained role in the family's expanding sphere of influence. Meanwhile, Rodrigo's unparalleled administrative skills, honed over decades, continued to make him utterly indispensable to successive popes. He meticulously reorganized the notoriously chaotic Vatican finances, streamlined the ponderous church bureaucracy, and created efficient systems that, astonishingly, actually worked. When crises inevitably arose, other cardinals, often men of lesser practical ability, consistently turned to Rodrigo, not necessarily because they liked or trusted him, but because he, with his pragmatic brilliance, consistently delivered tangible, effective results. By the pivotal year of 1490, Cardinal Rodrigo Borja, through a sheer combination of political acumen, relentless ambition, and moral flexibility, controlled more real, tangible power than many of the hereditary European monarchs of his time. His magnificent palaces, bursting with art and treasure, rivaled the grandest royal residences across the continent. His legendary parties were the talk of Italy, drawing in a dazzling array of dignitaries, schemers, and artists. His sprawling network of allies, agents, and informants stretched from the sun-drenched coasts of Spain all the way to the distant, exotic markets of Constantinople. And most critically, he had, over decades, meticulously accumulated enough personal wealth, obtained through means both legal and illicit, to decisively influence papal elections in ways that would have been utterly impossible for earlier, less resourceful generations. The stage was now meticulously set for what would become arguably the most controversial and fiercely contested papal election in the history of the Catholic Church. Pope Innocent VIII died in the oppressive heat of the Roman summer of 1492, plunging the Vatican into an immediate, feverish period of intense political calculation and backroom maneuvering. The College of Cardinals, the select body responsible for electing the new pontiff, found itself deeply and acrimoniously divided along numerous fault lines, between powerful Italian and foreign candidates, between passionate reformers and staunch traditionalists, between those who desired to continue existing policies and those who fiercely demanded radical change. It was into this swirling maelstrom of chaos, ambition, and uncertainty that a single, supremely prepared man stepped forward, a man who had spent a staggering 34 years meticulously preparing for exactly this moment, cultivating every connection, mastering every stratagem. Rodrigo Borgia didn't merely want to be pope. He had painstakingly architected his entire, controversial career around this singular, all-consuming ambition. And now, at the age of 61, his moment had arrived, and he was ready to deploy every single weapon in his considerable, formidable arsenal. The papal election of 1492, a conclave shrouded in intense secrecy and fervent prayer, was conducted behind the impenetrable, locked doors of the Vatican. Yet, the rumors that almost immediately began to leak out, swirling through the streets of Rome and echoing across Europe, were staggering even by the notoriously corrupt standards of the Renaissance era. Rodrigo Borgia, it was widely alleged, distributed truly vast sums of money, gold ducats, silver florins, and more, to cardinals whose support for his candidacy was either wavering or yet to be secured. He promised incredibly lucrative positions and high offices to their family members, ensuring future wealth and influence for generations. He offered sprawling estates, priceless artworks, and even mules heavily laden with silver to secure crucial votes, meticulously targeting each cardinal's specific greed or ambition. His most audacious and ultimately decisive move involved the influential Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, a man whose formidable support could single-handedly swing the entire election. Rodrigo reportedly promised Sforza the immensely powerful position of vice-chancellor, the very office Rodrigo himself had held for decades, along with all the immense wealth, vast patronage networks, and coveted privileges that Rodrigo had painstakingly accumulated in that role over his long career. It was an offer so staggeringly rich, so strategically irresistible, that it simply could not be refused. To refuse it would not only mean watching someone else claim the papacy, potentially at Sforza's own expense, but also, and perhaps more terrifyingly, facing the very real threat of swift, brutal retaliation from the newly elected Borgia pontiff. But here's what truly differentiated Rodrigo's approach from mere, crude bribery. He wasn't just buying votes with gold and promises. He was, with shrewd foresight, simultaneously offering a compelling vision of strong, decisive papal leadership, a vision that powerfully appealed to many cardinals who were utterly exhausted and frustrated by a succession of weak, ineffective popes. Rodrigo promised decisive action, effective and streamlined administration, and the kind of robust, unyielding leadership that could truly restore papal authority and prestige throughout Europe, which had been eroding for decades. When the final ballots were counted, the outcome sent shockwaves throughout Christendom. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia had, against all moral and traditional odds, achieved his life's singular ambition. He was elected pope, triumphantly taking the name Alexander VI. The announcement reverberated across Europe like a thunderclap. For the first time in over a century, the venerable Catholic Church would be led by a man who had not only openly flouted its most sacred rules and vows but had reveled in doing so. But Alexander's election was, chillingly, just the beginning. Now he had to prove, with ruthless action, that his decades of meticulous preparation, his audacious gambits, and his unbridled ambition had all been worth the immense, scandalous cost. Pope Alexander VI wasted absolutely no time in demonstrating, with breathtaking audacity, that his papacy would be unlike anything the Venerable Church had ever experienced before. Within mere weeks of his opulent coronation, he began implementing radical changes, initiating policies that would have been utterly unthinkable, even sacrilegious, under any of his predecessors. His paramount priority, pursued with ruthless single-mindedness, was the unshakable securing of his family's position for not just years, but for generations to come, ensuring a lasting Borgia dynasty. Alexander, with brazen disregard for canon law, appointed his infamous son Cesare as the Archbishop of Valencia, an astonishing move that made Cesare one of the youngest archbishops in the entire history of the Church, immediately granting him immense power and revenue. He meticulously arranged a series of strategic marriages for his other children, each a calculated political chess move, that would cement crucial alliances with Italy's most powerful noble families, weaving a complex web of loyalty and obligation. Most controversially, and with an almost defiant public display, he brought his beautiful teenage mistress, Giulia Farnese, to live in the Vatican itself, a move that shattered all remaining pretense of papal celibacy and propriety. The scandal was immediate, ferocious, and international, reverberating from the poorest Roman back alleys to the most gilded courts of Europe. European palaces buzzed with salacious gossip about the audacious pope who conducted himself not as a spiritual shepherd, but as a secular prince, openly flouting every sacred vow. Religious reformers across the continent, horrified by his blatant abuses, vehemently denounced Alexander as nothing less than the Antichrist himself. Political enemies, both within and outside the Church, immediately began plotting and scheming to remove him from power, either through deposition or, more likely, assassination. Yet Alexander, with his profound understanding of human nature and political theater, had meticulously anticipated all of this. He understood, with chilling clarity, that controversy, when properly managed and leveraged, could paradoxically strengthen his position rather than weaken it. By deliberately shocking and scandalizing his enemies, he was, in effect, forcing them to reveal themselves and their true intentions, exposing their vulnerabilities. By openly flouting deeply ingrained convention, he was powerfully demonstrating that he possessed the absolute authority and raw power to rewrite the rules entirely, asserting his will over tradition. More importantly, Alexander began to wield the immense resources of the papacy in ways that no previous pope had ever dared imagine, let alone execute. He treated the vast papal states, traditionally viewed as spiritual territories, not as sacred lands but as a formidable secular kingdom, a personal domain to be aggressively expanded, ruthlessly defended, and exploited for family gain. He immediately began planning audacious military campaigns, not for crusade, but to consolidate papal, and thus Borgia, control over the fractious territories of central Italy. He initiated complex, Machiavellian negotiations with foreign powers across Europe, strategically forging alliances that would extend the Borgias' political influence far beyond the traditional, limited boundaries of the Church itself. The transformation was breathtaking in its sheer scope, its audacity, and its speed. Within a single year of Alexander's election, the Vatican had ceased to be merely a venerable religious institution. It had become something entirely new, something revolutionary, the de facto headquarters of a powerful Renaissance dynasty, the Borgias, who, by a twist of fate, happened to control the Catholic Church, rather than a spiritual institution that merely happened to wield political power. But Alexander's most profound and truly significant innovation lay in the seamless, almost terrifyingly efficient manner in which he fully integrated his entire family into the very fabric of papal governance. While previous popes had certainly practiced nepotism, indulging their relatives with lucrative positions, Alexander elevated it to a sophisticated, meticulously designed system of government, a dynastic administration where blood loyalty trumped all. His children were not merely passive beneficiaries of his exalted position, they were active, indispensable participants in the formulation and ruthless execution of papal policy. Cesare, barely out of his tumultuous teens, was already being groomed and trained as his father's formidable military commander, destined to lead papal armies into battle. Lucrezia, still a child, was being meticulously evaluated for a series of strategic marriages, each one a calculated move on the grand political chessboard, designed to secure crucial alliances and expand Borgia influence. Even young Juan, though less capable than his siblings, was being meticulously prepared for significant roles that would advance Borgia interests across the vast European landscape. This wasn't merely crude corruption or simple favoritism. This was the deliberate, visionary creation of an entirely new model of papal leadership, one that borrowed heavily and alarmingly from the absolutist secular monarchies of the age. Alexander was fundamentally transforming the papacy itself, wrenching it from its traditional role as a purely spiritual office and remaking it into the very foundation of a powerful, enduring European dynasty. And he and his ambitious offspring were just getting started on their monumental, blood-soaked quest for ultimate power. The early years of Alexander VI's papacy, far from being a period of cautious consolidation, revealed the full, astonishing extent of his boundless ambitions. This was not a man content to merely manage the Church's existing territories and established influence. No, this was someone who audaciously intended to leverage the immense authority and resources of the papacy as a colossal launching pad for grand conquests that would fundamentally reshape the entire geopolitical map of Europe. His financial innovations, in particular, were breathtaking in their sheer audacity and moral depravity. Alexander, with the cunning of a Renaissance banker and the cynicism of a hardened mercenary, created entirely new revenue streams that would have made even the most cutthroat merchants of his era green with envy. He shamelessly sold church offices, from bishoprics to cardinalates, to the highest bidders, effectively creating a bustling, corrupt marketplace for ecclesiastical advancement, where spiritual merit was irrelevant compared to financial muscle. He quite literally invented new religious observances, obscure saints' days, and special dispensations that required substantial, mandatory payments from the faithful, turning piety into profit. He even went so far as to commission fake religious relics, then shamelessly charged eager, gullible pilgrims exorbitant, premium prices to view them, exploiting their fervent belief for personal gain. Most famously, Alexander instituted a grand jubilee year in 1500, declaring it a special, exceptionally holy year that, he claimed, occurred only once per century, a rare spiritual opportunity. He then shrewdly announced that a hitherto secret, holy door in St. Peter's Basilica would be miraculously opened for public viewing, but only for those willing to pay truly substantial fees to gain access to this supposed spiritual privilege. The door itself was, in reality, a recent addition that Alexander had secretly commissioned and had installed shortly before, a masterful deception. But the thousands of fervent pilgrims who flocked to Rome, desperate for spiritual solace and remission of sins, had no way of knowing this elaborate fraud. These weren't just simple money-making schemes. They were masterful demonstrations of Alexander's profound understanding of human psychology, his chilling capacity for mass manipulation, and his keen grasp of market dynamics. By deliberately creating artificial scarcity and granting seemingly exclusive access to spiritual favors, he was simultaneously generating immense revenue and, more importantly, cultivating a potent sense of papal authority and mystique that transcended traditional religious boundaries, positioning himself as an ultimate arbiter of salvation. But Alexander's true, insidious masterpiece was the meticulous, ruthless way he began positioning his formidable son, Cesare, for ultimate greatness. By 1498, it had become terrifyingly clear that Cesare had not only inherited all of his father's formidable intelligence and boundless ambition, but also possessed a chilling ruthlessness, a capacity for brutality, that exceeded even Alexander's considerable aptitude for cruelty. The partnership between Pope Alexander and his brilliant, terrifying son Cesare was rapidly coalescing into the most formidable, and indeed dangerous, political alliance in all of Renaissance Europe. Together, with a shared vision and an unwavering will, they would attempt something that no previous papal family, no other pontiff, had ever dared to conceive: the audacious creation of a vast Borgia kingdom, a secular state carved out of Italy that would dominate the entire peninsula and fundamentally challenge the established political order throughout the continent. What happened next would make everything that had come before, the intrigues, the scandals, the ruthless power plays, seem like mere, elaborate preparation for the main, cataclysmic event. The pivotal moment that would irrevocably define both the infamous Borgia legacy and the very future of Renaissance politics arrived in the scorching summer of 1498. Cesare Borgia, a mere 23 years old, made a decision so audacious, so utterly unprecedented, that it sent shockwaves reverberating throughout every court and cloister in Europe, fundamentally altering forever how power could be wielded within the sacred confines of the Catholic Church. He resigned from the venerable College of Cardinals. This wasn't merely unusual, this was absolutely revolutionary. Never before in the entire sprawling history of the Church had anyone, not a single soul, voluntarily relinquished a cardinal's hat. The position of cardinal was universally considered a sacred calling, a lifetime appointment imbued with both immense spiritual authority and formidable political power. Cardinals were, in essence, the princes of the Church, men who stood, without question, at the absolute pinnacle of medieval society, second only to the Pope himself. But Cesare Borgia, with his cold, calculating gaze, wasn't interested in merely being a prince of the Church, confined by its spiritual dictates. He wanted, with an unbridled, secular ambition, to be a prince, a temporal ruler of his own kingdom, beholden to no one. His official resignation letter, a carefully crafted masterpiece of cynical political theater, claimed that he felt a divine calling to serve God in a different capacity, that his prodigious talents lay not in spiritual guidance or theological debate, but rather in dynamic military leadership. He spoke eloquently of defending Christendom against its multitudinous enemies, of securing the vulnerable papal territories through decisive force rather than through prayer or diplomacy. The real reason, of course, simmering beneath the polished rhetoric, was infinitely more ambitious, more chillingly pragmatic. Cesare, with his razor-sharp intellect, had meticulously studied the fragmented political landscape of Italy. He recognized, with startling clarity, an unprecedented window of opportunity. The peninsula was fractured into dozens of competing, often weak, and poorly defended city-states, ripe for conquest. The major European powers, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, were conveniently distracted by their own internecine conflicts elsewhere, their attention diverted from Italy. And most crucially, his doting, powerful father, Pope Alexander VI, controlled the immense resources of the entire Catholic Church, including its armies and vast treasury. If there was ever a singular moment when a brilliant, utterly ruthless young man could carve out a formidable kingdom for himself from the chaotic tapestry of Italy, this, Cesare knew, was emphatically it. Unsurprisingly, Pope Alexander VI, his father and co-conspirator, supported his son's audacious decision completely and without reservation. In fact, it is now widely understood that Cesare's resignation was almost certainly orchestrated, down to the last meticulous detail, by the Pope himself, a grand design born from their combined ambition. Within mere hours of Cesare's public announcement, Alexander had already deftly arranged for the powerful French King Louis XII to grant Cesare the prestigious title of Duke of Valentinois, a secular dukedom that instantly elevated Cesare's temporal status. The astonishing speed and seamless execution of this arrangement revealed, in stark terms, just how extensively and far in advance the Borgias had been planning and strategizing for this very moment, a testament to their long-term, dynastic vision. But the ducal title, however prestigious, was merely the ceremonial beginning. Alexander also provided Cesare with something far more tangible, far more valuable, and far more lethal. Vast papal armies, immense papal funds drawn directly from the church treasury, and, crucially, explicit papal authority to conquer territories across Italy, ostensibly in the name of the church, and to restore papal control. Cesare would, technically, be fighting to suppress rebellious territories and bring them back under the Holy See's dominion. Yet everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the most cunning prince, understood the chillingly clear real agenda. The Borgias were not merely reasserting spiritual authority, they were brazenly launching a full-scale military conquest of Italy, a naked power grab thinly veiled by religious pretense. Cesari's first military campaign began in the early months of 1499, and it immediately demonstrated, with terrifying clarity, that the young duke possessed military talents that more than matched his already legendary political acumen. Unlike many Renaissance commanders of his era, who often relied on elaborate, protracted strategies and lengthy, costly sieges that could drag on for months or even years, Cesare favored swift, decisive action, movements so rapid and unexpected they caught his enemies completely off guard, paralyzing them with fear and confusion. His initial targets were the strategically vital cities of Imola and Forli, both then controlled by the formidable Riario family. These were not random choices, far from it. The Riarios had been long-standing, bitter enemies of the Borgias, and their territories controlled crucial trade routes that would provide both immense strategic advantage in central Italy and substantial, much-needed revenue for Cesari's burgeoning war chest. Cesari's approach to siege warfare was both chillingly methodical and terrifyingly brutal. He would arrive at each city with an overwhelming, seemingly irresistible force, making it explicitly clear that immediate surrender would be handsomely rewarded, while any resistance, however slight, would be met with extraordinary, unforgettable brutality and merciless punishment. But he also offered something else, something that many corrupt or incompetent Italian rulers of the time couldn't: competent, effective governance. The territories that Cesare swiftly conquered weren't merely occupied and plundered, they were systematically transformed. He installed efficient, loyal administrators, diligently improved local infrastructure, and established legal systems that, remarkably, actually functioned fairly, bringing a measure of order and justice. Citizens who had long suffered under the capricious whims of corrupt or incompetent local rulers often found themselves living under a government that, while undeniably authoritarian and ruthless, was also surprisingly effective and brought a degree of stability they hadn't known. This pragmatic approach was not accidental. It was a core tenet of Cesari's grand strategy. He understood, with profound clarity, that military conquest was only the first, bloody step in building lasting power and a durable kingdom. Unless he could win at least the grudging loyalty, or at least the fearful acquiescence, of the people he conquered, his newly acquired territories would remain vulnerable to reconquest the moment he moved his armies on to his next target. His success was both immediate and spectacularly evident. By the year 1500, Cesare Borgia, having proved himself as both a brilliant, ruthless military commander and an astonishingly effective administrator, was attracting fearful, fascinated attention throughout every court and intellectual circle in Europe. Contemporary observers, those keen enough to discern the winds of change, began to realize, with growing alarm, that they were witnessing something truly unprecedented in the annals of European history. A papal family, utilizing the vast spiritual and material resources of the Catholic Church, was openly and aggressively building a formidable secular kingdom, a personal domain that could, in its ambition and military might, rival the long-established powers of Europe. The Borgias, it was becoming chillingly clear, were not merely corrupt clergy members leveraging their positions for personal gain. They were, in essence, revolutionary politicians, audacious innovators who were, with every conquest and every ruthless decision, fundamentally rewriting the deeply ingrained rules of Renaissance power. And they, in their relentless, blood-soaked quest, were truly just getting started. The year 1502 marked the absolute apex of Cesare Borgia's military genius and the moment when European observers, watching from afar, finally truly grasped the terrifying magnitude of the Borgia family's boundless ambitions. That year, Cesare, with a strategic brilliance and a speed that defied belief, achieved something that seasoned, veteran military commanders had failed to accomplish for decades. He conquered the Duchy of Urbino in a single, audacious night. The Duke of Urbino, Guidobaldo da Montefeltro, was not some minor, inexperienced noble. He was widely regarded as one of Italy's most respected military leaders, a seasoned veteran of countless Renaissance wars, renowned for his strategic acumen and his formidable fortifications. His duchy was considered, by all military experts, to be virtually impregnable, protected not only by formidable, state-of-the-art fortifications and natural defenses, but also defended by an army of experienced, loyal troops. The very idea that such a stronghold could fall to a surprise attack seemed, to most, utterly impossible, a fantastical notion. But Cesare, with his meticulous planning and relentless pursuit of intelligence, had spent months, not weeks but months, obsessively studying his target. His network of spies and informants had gathered every conceivable piece of intelligence. Detailed troop movements, patterns of watchmen, the precise locations of weaknesses in the city's seemingly impenetrable defenses, even the psychological profiles of its key commanders. Cultivating allies within Urbino itself. When he finally made his move, it was with the chilling precision of a master surgeon and the unstoppable velocity of a lightning strike. On the night of June 20, 1502, Cesari's formidable forces materialized outside Urbino's ancient walls, catching the unsuspecting city entirely by surprise. Duke Guidobaldo de Montefeltro, a man accustomed to the relative security of his ducal palace, awoke to a nightmare. His city was already encircled, and, perhaps more devastatingly, several of his most trusted commanders had shamelessly defected to the Borgias. Rather than endure a hopeless siege that would inevitably lead to his downfall, he made the agonizing decision to flee into exile, abandoning his ancestral duchy without a single blow struck in its defense. The rapid and effortless conquest of Urbino sent convulsive shockwaves across the entire Italian peninsula. It was a brutal, undeniable demonstration that no territory, no matter how ancient its lineage or how formidable its defenses, was truly safe from the insatiable ambition of the Borgias. If Cesare could seize a city like Urbino in a single, audacious night, what then was beyond his grasp? Yet, the true significance of this lightning victory lay not just in the conquest itself, but in what it brilliantly illuminated about Cesari's strategic genius. He wasn't merely acquiring territories at random like a child collecting trinkets. He was meticulously, systematically forging a cohesive, continuous block of Borgia-controlled land that would stretch like a military highway across the heart of central Italy. Each successive conquest eased the path for the next, allowing him unparalleled freedom to move troops, supplies, and information swiftly and securely between his burgeoning domains. More critically, Cesare was showcasing a level of military innovation and tactical acumen that left even his seasoned enemies grudgingly impressed. His ingenious integration of diverse forces, the heavy cavalry of French troops, the disciplined phalanxes of Swiss infantry, and the ruthless efficiency of Italian mercenaries, revealed a sophisticated, almost modern, understanding of how disparate military traditions could be seamlessly combined for maximum, devastating effectiveness. His shadowy intelligence networks, a web of informants and spies unseen and unheard, burrowed deep into enemy territories, furnishing him with crucial information that consistently allowed him to strike with surgical precision before his adversaries could even contemplate preparation. His formidable diplomatic skills, a potent blend of charm and veiled threats, expertly isolated his chosen targets, ensuring they stood alone and friendless before his inevitable assault. Perhaps most profoundly, this period of relentless expansion and strategic brilliance began to attract the intense, discerning gaze of Niccolò Machiavelli, the keen Florentine diplomat and burgeoning political theorist, who would later immortalize Cesari's audacious methods in his seminal work, The Prince. Machiavelli found himself utterly captivated by Cesari's potent fusion of unyielding ruthlessness and undeniable effectiveness, his uncanny ability to inspire both paralyzing fear and fervent loyalty, his perverse talent for transforming bitter enemies into strategic allies through the calculated application of both overwhelming force and subtle favor. In Cesare Borgia, Machiavelli recognized the living embodiment of his own nascent political philosophy, that truly effective leadership demanded the rare capacity to be both feared and, when expedient, loved, that successful rulers must possess an unwavering willingness to act with absolute decisiveness when circumstances dictated, and that moral considerations, though perhaps comforting, were ultimately secondary to the cold, hard calculus of practical results. The evolving, complex relationship between Cesare and Machiavelli would blossom into one of the most profoundly influential partnerships in the entire history of political thought, giving birth to radical ideas that would reshape the very nature of governance for centuries to come. However, even as Cesare Borgia was dramatically revolutionizing Renaissance warfare and fundamentally altering the landscape of political strategy, formidable forces were inexorably gathering, destined to ultimately challenge and perhaps even shatter everything the Borgias had so painstakingly constructed. Their very success, a dazzling but terrifying spectacle, was ironically sowing the seeds of their own destruction, forging a growing legion of enemies who now viscerally understood that the meteoric rise of Borgia power constituted an existential threat, an unholy disruption to the delicate, established order of Italian states. The intricate, deadly conspiracy that would nearly bring them to ruin was already, in the shadows, taking malevolent shape. What unfolded next stands as one of the most brilliantly conceived and executed tactical maneuvers in all of military history, and it is about to lay bare precisely why Cesare Borgia became the archetypal model for virtually every political strategist who followed in his wake. If you seek to truly comprehend how power players operate with chilling efficacy when their backs are literally against the wall, then you absolutely need to witness this. Ensure you're subscribed, because the advanced techniques we're about to unveil are, even today, regularly employed by countless politicians and business leaders whom we meticulously cover in our ongoing series. By the waning months of 1502, the breathtakingly rapid expansion of Borgia power had forged a precarious and dangerous situation, one that even Cesare's formidable military genius couldn't entirely command. His relentless conquests had undeniably made him staggeringly powerful, a force to be reckoned with across Italy. Yet, this very success had also, paradoxically, galvanized and united his enemies in unprecedented ways, coalescing into threats that challenged the very foundations of the Borgia family's edifice. The immediate concern wasn't merely that Cesare had seized specific territories. It was the chilling realization that his audacious methods threatened to completely revolutionize, and indeed, fundamentally reorder, Italian politics as a whole. Should the Borgia model ultimately prevail, it would irrevocably prove that papal families could brazenly leverage the sacred resources of the Church to construct powerful, secular kingdoms. This terrifying prospect sent shivers of dread through the veins of every established ruler across the peninsula, threatening to upend centuries of tradition and balance of power. Even more immediately perilous was the burgeoning coalition of condottieri, the professional mercenary commanders who had, until recently, served faithfully under Cesare's banner. These seasoned warriors were now beginning to question, with grave concern, whether their long-term interests truly aligned with the Borgias' relentless, expansionist ambitions. Initially drawn by Cesare's glittering gold and his unbroken string of military triumphs, they were now slowly, chillingly, coming to the realization that his ultimate, grander goals might very well necessitate their elimination as potential rivals to his singular authority. The conspiracy that simmered to the surface in late 1502 was spearheaded by some of Italy's most experienced and battle-hardened military minds, Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverado da Fermo, and the formidable Paolo and Francesco Orsini. These were men who had not only fought side by side with Cesare but, crucially, understood both his tactical brilliance and his underlying vulnerabilities with an intimacy that few others possessed. Their plan was a masterpiece of Machiavellian subtlety, both sophisticated in its design and perilous in its execution. Rather than foolishly confronting Cesare in open battle, where his superior resources and tactical acumen would undoubtedly grant him decisive advantages, they resolved to turn his own playbook against him. They would feign a heartfelt reconciliation, artfully lure him into a seemingly vulnerable position, and then, when he was isolated from the bulk of his main forces, eliminate him with cold, surgical precision. What these cunning conspirators failed to fully grasp, however, was that Cesare, the master strategist, had been anticipating precisely this kind of insidious betrayal for months. His unparalleled intelligence networks, a web of spies and informants stretching across Italy, had been meticulously monitoring the conspirators' every move, every whispered conversation, every secret rendezvous. Consequently, he had already begun to meticulously develop countermeasures, an elaborate and deadly trap designed to turn their very own strategy spectacularly against them. The confrontation that would inevitably follow would become indelibly etched in the annals of Renaissance political warfare, a breathtaking masterpiece of deception and counter-deception that would unequivocally demonstrate why Cesare Borgia was widely considered the single most formidable political operator of his tumultuous era. On the fateful date of December 31, 1502, Cesare met with the conspirators in the unassuming town of Sinigaglia, ostensibly to discuss the precise terms for their much-anticipated reconciliation. The conspirators, brimming with a dangerous overconfidence, believed they were walking into a negotiation where they held all the strategic advantages, ready to dictate terms to a cornered duke. Instead, with a chilling twist of fate, they were unknowingly stepping into the most meticulously orchestrated trap in the entire annals of Renaissance political history. Cesare had dedicated weeks to the painstaking preparation for this single, decisive moment, strategically positioning loyal troops throughout the town, identifying every conceivable escape route, and ensuring, with the unwavering precision of a clockmaker, that every minute detail of the meeting would unfurl precisely according to his masterful design. When the unsuspecting conspirators finally arrived, they were confronted not by a vulnerable duke seeking desperate accommodation, but by a chillingly composed master strategist, a political maestro who had not merely anticipated their every move, but had meticulously planned for it. The consequences were as swift as they were brutal. By the close of that chilling evening, several of the conspiracy's ringleaders lay dead, others were summarily captured, and the entire treacherous plot had been not merely thwarted, but transformed into a terrifying, visceral demonstration of Borgia power, a stark and unambiguous message seared into the minds of anyone else contemplating similar acts of betrayal. The Sinigaglia trap represented the absolute pinnacle of Cesare's political and military genius. It served as irrefutable proof that he was not just an astonishingly effective conqueror of lands and peoples, but also an undisputed master of the intricate, deadly psychological warfare that was the very lifeblood of Renaissance politics. Yet, even as Cesare was so ruthlessly eliminating his enemies and solidifying his iron grip on power, a more insidious enemy was quietly, relentlessly, at work. Time itself, steadily running out for the entire Borgia dynasty. The very success that had catapulted them to the zenith of fear and influence in Italy was, with cruel irony, also creating the inexorable conditions for their eventual catastrophic downfall. The aftermath of Sinigaglia, a moment of profound triumph for Cesare, marked a critical turning point in his career, though few observers at the time fully appreciated its subtle yet far-reaching implications. While European courts marveled at his audacious tactical brilliance, a more profound, almost imperceptible transformation was unfolding within Cesare himself. He was evolving from a mere military commander into something far more dangerous, far more sophisticated, a true Renaissance prince who possessed the chilling insight that genuine, enduring power resided not merely in conquering territories, but in constructing intricate systems of governance that could transcend and outlast any individual ruler. This profound evolution in Cesare's political thinking attracted, with irresistible force, the piercing attention of one of history's most perceptive political minds. Niccolò Machiavelli, then serving as a diplomatic envoy from the Florentine Republic, had been observing Cesare's meteoric rise with an almost feverish fascination. What he meticulously witnessed during those pivotal months of 1502 and 1503 would not merely influence, but fundamentally redefine political philosophy for centuries to come. Machiavelli's admiration extended far beyond Cesare's undeniable military victories. He was utterly captivated by the young duke's revolutionary approach to governance itself. Unlike traditional rulers who relied almost entirely on inherited legitimacy or the divine sanction of religious authority, Cesare was, with breathtaking audacity, creating power from first principles, forging it from scratch through sheer, unadulterated competence and groundbreaking strategic thinking. He was, in essence, proving that in the right hands, a potent combination of piercing intelligence and unflinching ruthlessness could definitively overcome any perceived disadvantage of birth or circumstance. During their various meetings and exchanges, Machiavelli meticulously observed Cesare demonstrate principles that would later become the very cornerstones of modern political theory. The critical importance of maintaining multiple viable options in any negotiation, the profound value of inspiring both fear and unwavering respect in one's subordinates, the absolute necessity of decisive action when circumstances demanded it without hesitation, and, perhaps most artfully, the subtle, deceptive art of appearing far stronger than one actually was, while never, ever revealing the full, terrifying extent of one's true capabilities. Perhaps most significantly, Machiavelli keenly observed how Cesare was systematically attempting to solve the foundational, seemingly intractable problem that had plagued virtually all Renaissance rulers: how to forge and maintain genuine stability in an inherently chaotic and unstable political environment. Traditional approaches had, for generations, relied on abstract concepts like divine right, ancient bloodlines, or the fickle whims of popular consent. Cesare, with his characteristic pragmatism, was pioneering something altogether different, something radical and unprecedented, a system of governance rooted purely in demonstrable effectiveness within the territories under his direct control. Across his expanding domains, Cesare had meticulously implemented administrative reforms that not only existed on paper but genuinely, tangibly improved the daily lives of the common people. He had established efficient, centralized tax collection systems that, for the first time in many regions, dramatically reduced rampant corruption. He had created equitable courts that were designed to deliver genuine justice rather than merely serving the highest bidder. He had invested in vital infrastructure that facilitated burgeoning trade and seamless communication throughout his burgeoning state. Most critically, he had unequivocally demonstrated that a strong, centralized authority could provide the essential security that allowed both commerce and culture to not just survive, but truly flourish. These were far more than just practical improvements; they were nothing less than revolutionary political statements. Cesare Borgia was irrefutably proving that legitimacy, the very right to rule, could be earned through competent, effective governance, rather than merely inherited through the accident of noble birth. He was demonstrating, with chilling clarity, that people would indeed accept and even embrace authoritarian rule if that rule consistently delivered tangible, undeniable benefits to their lives. Machiavelli, with his unparalleled intellectual foresight, understood with profound clarity that he was witnessing the genesis of an entirely new model of political leadership, one that would possess profound and lasting implications for how power would be exercised and understood across the entirety of Europe. The Prince, the monumental treatise he would eventually pen, was not some abstract, theoretical construct. It was, in its essence, Cesare Borgia himself, his strategies, his ruthlessness, his genius, refined, systematized, and distilled into a practical, enduring blueprint for effective governance. However, even as Cesare was so effectively revolutionizing the very fabric of Renaissance politics, he was simultaneously and unwittingly forging a strategic vulnerability that would ultimately prove fatal. His entire intricate system, this powerful edifice he had constructed, depended precariously on the continued, unwavering support of the papacy. And that support, in turn, rested entirely on the fragile life and increasingly precarious health of one increasingly elderly man, Pope Alexander VI. The Pope, Cesare's formidable father, was now 72 years old, and the relentless, grueling pace of the Borgia family's expansion was visibly taking its toll. The incessant political maneuvering, the crushing financial pressures of funding ceaseless military campaigns, and the sheer, unending stress of managing a sprawling family dynasty that operated across multiple countries were steadily eroding even his once formidable constitution. More ominously, Alexander's myriad enemies were beginning to grasp a critical, chilling truth. They didn't necessarily need to defeat Cesare in open battle. They merely needed to outlast his father. Every single day that passed brought the inevitable papal succession closer, like a ticking clock, and when that fateful moment finally arrived, the entire Borgia edifice, built on years of ruthless ambition, would face its ultimate, gravest test. The papal election that would inevitably follow Alexander's death would not merely determine the next spiritual leader of the Catholic Church. It would, with breathtaking finality, decide whether the revolutionary Borgia experiment in Italian politics would continue to thrive, or whether the established, traditional order would violently reassert itself, crushing everything Cesare had built. Everything Cesare had achieved, all the territories he had so audaciously conquered, all the sophisticated systems he had so meticulously created, would hinge entirely on securing a friendly, malleable successor to his powerful father. This critical strategic vulnerability was becoming painfully apparent to astute observers throughout the major courts of Europe. Venice, ever mercantile and pragmatic, Florence, always watchful and calculating, and Naples, anxious for its own security, all began making quiet, urgent preparations for a radically different, post-Borgia, Italy. French and Spanish diplomats, always vying for influence, discreetly commenced cultivating relationships with cardinals who might sway the upcoming papal election. Even the Holy Roman Emperor, a distant but powerful figure, began pondering how Habsburg interests might be best advanced once Alexander was no longer on the papal throne. Most perilously of all, the powerful, ancient Roman noble families, the Orsinis, the Colonnas, and other traditional power brokers, who had been so ruthlessly displaced and humiliated by Borgia expansion, began, with steely resolve, to plot their long-awaited revenge. They had been biding their time, nursing their grievances, patiently waiting for the precise moment when they could reclaim their ancestral influence and lost properties. They understood, with chilling clarity, that Cesare's unparalleled military genius would count for little if he lost ultimate control of the vast, indispensable resources of the Vatican. The stage was meticulously being set for an epic confrontation, one that would ultimately determine not only the immediate fate of the Borgia family, but the very future direction of Renaissance politics for generations to come. Would the bold, new model of governance that Cesare had so audaciously pioneered manage to survive its creator, standing testament to his genius? Or would the traditional, entrenched power structures of Italy brutally reassert themselves once the protective mantle of papal authority was unceremoniously ripped away? The answers to these momentous questions lay waiting, concealed within the humid, disease-ridden, and utterly suffocating streets of Rome during the deadly, malaria-infested summer of 1503. As that sweltering summer of 1503 relentlessly approached, both Alexander and Cesare seemed to grasp, with a chilling clarity, that their precious time was rapidly dwindling. Their frantic actions during those crucial, oppressive months painted a stark picture of a family desperately striving to secure their hard-won legacy before insurmountable circumstances, irrevocably beyond their control, could intervene. Alexander, with a frantic energy belying his age, intensified his efforts to pack the College of Cardinals with loyal Borgia allies and staunch supporters. He brazenly created new cardinalates, specifically designed to dilute the influence of his growing list of enemies, auctioning these sacred positions off to the highest bidders and using the considerable proceeds to fund Cesare's ceaseless, grinding military campaigns. The papal treasury, a sacred repository, was being systematically, scandalously drained, all in a desperate bid to purchase what they fervently hoped would be lasting political influence. Meanwhile, Cesare, ever the man of action, dramatically accelerated his conquest of the remaining independent territories in central Italy. He understood, with grim determination, that every single city he brought under his control, every fortress he captured, every new alliance he secured, would undeniably strengthen his precarious position when the inevitable, dreaded papal transition finally occurred. But this relentless, rapid expansion also carried a heavy cost. His forces were stretched increasingly thin, dangerously dispersed across a widening, vulnerable geographic area. The complex, almost symbiotic relationship between father and son during this tumultuous period was a source of endless fascination for contemporary observers. Alexander and Cesare had forged a partnership that profoundly transcended mere normal family bonds. They were, in essence, ruthless political collaborators, two halves of a formidable whole, who possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses, expertly compensating for them. Alexander provided the immense institutional authority of the papacy and the critical financial resources that made Caesari's breathtaking conquests possible, while Cesare, in turn, delivered the spectacular military successes that undeniably enhanced papal prestige and vastly expanded its temporal power. Yet, their collaboration also starkly revealed the fundamental, undeniable tension at the very heart of the entire Borgia project. Alexander was, at least technically, still the Pope of the Catholic Church. His actions were, ostensibly, meant to serve the broader, divine interests of Christianity, not merely the blatant advancement of his notoriously secular family. Critics throughout Europe were becoming increasingly vocal, their condemnations ringing louder and clearer, about the profound scandal of a pope who so flagrantly used the sacred resources of the Church primarily to enrich his own relatives. Cesare, meanwhile, was constructing something that bore a far closer resemblance to a secular kingdom, complete with its own efficient yet authoritarian administration, its professional yet ruinously expensive military, and its pragmatic diplomatic relationships that frequently clashed with traditional papal alliances, than it did to a mere ecclesiastical territory. The glaring contradiction between their proclaimed religious authority and their nakedly secular ambitions was becoming, for many, utterly impossible to ignore. Reform-minded cardinals within the Church, horrified by what they perceived as the complete corruption of the papal office, were discreetly but determinately beginning to organize opposition. European monarchs, who had initially welcomed strong papal leadership as a bulwark against chaos, were now growing increasingly anxious about the alarming implications of a militarized, overtly secularized papacy wielding such immense power. Even some of their former allies, once loyal, were now openly questioning whether the audacious Borgia experiment had perhaps ventured too far, crossing unforgivable lines. These rapidly growing tensions reached a fever pitch during the scorching, oppressive Roman summer of 1503. The ancient city was in the throes of one of its worst malaria outbreaks in decades. The insidious disease, which thrived in Rome's infamous swampy climate, was indiscriminately claiming victims throughout the entire population, and even the sacred confines of the Vatican itself proved tragically immune to its devastating effects. On August 5, both Pope Alexander and Cesare attended a dinner party at the opulent villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellaxi. It was intended to be a grand celebration of recent military successes and a strategic opportunity to meticulously plan future campaigns. Instead, with a cruel twist of fate, it became the unsuspecting beginning of the end for the Borgia dynasty. Within a matter of days following the lavish dinner, both father and son fell violently, horrifyingly ill, exhibiting a terrifying array of symptoms that included soaring high fevers, severe, debilitating vomiting, and periods of disorienting delirium. Rumors, as swift and virulent as the disease itself, immediately began circulating that they had been poisoned, perhaps by cunning enemies who had cleverly infiltrated the dinner party, or even, more chillingly, by their very host, Cardinal Castellaxi, who may have harbored his own profound reasons for desiring the Borgias' elimination. The poison theory seemed chillingly plausible to many contemporary observers. The Borgias, after all, had cultivated a vast and vengeful network of enemies who would undoubtedly have benefited immensely from their sudden, untimely deaths. Furthermore, they themselves had earned a notorious reputation for ruthlessly employing poison as a political weapon, leading to widespread, fearful speculation that they had finally, ironically, fallen victim to their own signature methods. However, modern historians, with the benefit of hindsight and forensic analysis, generally converge on the belief that Alexander and Cesare were, in fact, tragic victims of the virulent malaria epidemic that was devastating Rome that summer. The precise symptoms they displayed were strikingly consistent with a severe bout of malaria, and the timing of their illness coincided exactly with the peak of the outbreak. The pervasive poison rumors, therefore, were most likely a grim testament to the Borgias' infamous reputation for intrigue and ruthlessness, rather than actual evidence of a meticulously planned assassination. Regardless of its exact cause, the implications of their sudden, devastating illness were immediate and utterly catastrophic for everything the family had so painstakingly built. Alexander, already 72 years old and in declining health even before the illness struck, faced minimal chances of survival from the very outset. Cesare, younger and considerably stronger, found himself confronting the terrifying prospect of losing his essential papal protection at the absolute worst possible moment. As news of their dire illness spread like wildfire throughout Rome and beyond, the intricate political calculations that had been quietly developing for months suddenly transformed into a frantic, urgent scramble. Cardinals, sensing the imminent power vacuum, began feverishly positioning themselves for the papal election that now seemed terrifyingly close. European powers, always opportunistic, immediately started drawing up contingency plans for a radically different, post-Borgia Italy. Most ominously, the numerous enemies whom Cesare had so ruthlessly defeated or displaced, smelling blood in the water, began, with vengeful anticipation, preparing to reclaim their lost territories and settle long-festering old scores. The Borgia Empire, so meticulously constructed through decades of careful planning and ruthless execution, was about to face its ultimate existential test. Everything, quite literally, would depend on whether Cesare could recover swiftly enough to maintain a semblance of control over his territories and critically influence the impending papal succession, or whether the formidable forces arrayed against the family would finally seize their long-awaited opportunity for brutal revenge. Pope Alexander VI died on August 18, 1503, after 2 agonizing weeks of illness, marking the definitive end of one of the most controversial and profoundly consequential papacies in the entire history of the Catholic Church. Within mere hours of his passing, the meticulously constructed political machine that had so audaciously elevated the Borgias to unprecedented heights of power began, with startling and brutal speed, to unravel completely. Cesare, still gravely ill and fever-racked, was rendered profoundly vulnerable at the very moment he most desperately needed to project an image of unyielding strength and decisive action. The vast territories he had so ruthlessly conquered through years of relentless military campaigns suddenly appeared dangerously exposed to reconquest. The intricate alliances he had so skillfully forged through diplomatic cunning and strategic marriages now seemed utterly fragile, stripped bare of the papal authority that had once reinforced them. The colossal financial resources that had fueled his breathtaking expansion were now, with cruel irony, controlled by whoever would emerge as the next pope. Most critically, the catastrophic timing of Alexander's death caught Cesare entirely unprepared for the momentous papal succession. He had always, with characteristic foresight, assumed he would have ample advanced warning of his father's declining health, granting him precious time to strategically position allies within the College of Cardinals and secure ironclad commitments from potential papal candidates. Instead, he found himself helplessly bedridden with a raging fever while the single most important election of his lifetime unfolded without his direct, vital influence. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death vividly revealed just how many implacable enemies the Borgias had accumulated during their meteoric rise to power. Roman noble families, who had been so ruthlessly displaced and humiliated by Borgia expansion, immediately began, with vengeful alacrity, reclaiming their properties and positions. Cardinals who had been marginalized and silenced during Alexander's papacy swiftly started asserting their long-suppressed authority within church governance. Foreign powers, who had been grudgingly forced to accommodate Borgia interests, now eagerly began exploring entirely new diplomatic options, seeing a clear opening. Perhaps most dangerously, some of Cesare's own mercenary military commanders, notoriously pragmatic in their allegiances, began openly questioning their loyalty to a leader who might no longer be able to reliably pay their wages or effectively protect their interests. Professional soldiers, after all, were driven by contracts and cold calculation, and a weakened, feverish Cesare represented, to them, a potentially very poor investment of their valuable services. The papal conclave that convened to select Alexander's successor was arguably one of the most politically charged and bitterly contested in church history. Every cardinal, keenly aware of the seismic shift occurring, understood with chilling clarity that their choice would determine not only the immediate future of the Catholic Church but also the ultimate fate of the Borgia territories and, indeed, the broader balance of power across the entire Italian peninsula. Cesare, despite his debilitating illness, desperately attempted to influence the election from his sickbed. He leveraged what meager financial resources remained to secure promises from various candidates. He even tried to exploit his military control over certain parts of Rome to exert pressure on the cardinals. He went so far as to attempt to use his sister Lucrezia's extensive marriage connections to build support among influential Italian noble families. But these desperate efforts were tragically hampered by his profound physical debility and by the simple, undeniable fact that many cardinals viewed the papal succession as a heaven-sent opportunity to restore traditional church governance after years of what they saw as scandalous Borgia innovation. They yearned for a pope who would prioritize spiritual leadership over naked territorial expansion, who would decisively return to conventional ecclesiastical practices rather than recklessly continuing the Borgia experiment in a militarized, secularized papacy. The cardinal who ultimately emerged victorious as Pope Pius III represented precisely this kind of conventional, reform-minded choice. He was an elderly, pious man, deeply committed to genuine church reform. Crucially, he had no family members strategically positioned to benefit from papal nepotism, and he showed absolutely no interest in continuing Alexander's aggressive military campaigns or territorial ambitions. For a brief, fleeting moment it seemed that Cesare might, against all odds, be able to forge a working relationship with the new pope. Pius, in a gesture of continuity, even confirmed him as Captain General of the Church, tentatively suggesting that there might indeed be some stability in papal military policy. But this fragile hope proved tragically short-lived. Pius III died after an astonishingly brief 26 days in office, creating a second, even more urgent papal succession crisis, ironically just as Cesare was beginning to physically recover his health and tentatively reassert his political influence. The Second Conclave of 1503 would prove even more utterly decisive for Borgia fortunes. This time, the cardinals, weary from months of profound uncertainty and political turmoil, were resolutely determined to choose a pope who could provide stable, long-term leadership. The man they ultimately selected would either decisively validate the Borgia model of papal governance or, with equal force, repudiate it entirely, consigning it to the dustbin of history. The cardinal who emerged from this conclave as Pope Julius II was, in virtually every conceivable way, the precise antithesis of Alexander VI. Giuliano della Rovere had been one of the Borgias' most relentless and persistent enemies throughout their entire scandalous rise to power. He had vehemently opposed Alexander's election in 1492, had vociferously criticized Borgia policies throughout the tumultuous 1490s, and had been forced into humiliating exile during the very height of Borgia influence. Now, with a chilling sense of destiny fulfilled, he was pope, and he possessed both the supreme authority of the papacy and the burning personal motivation to systematically dismantle, stone by stone, everything the Borgias had so audaciously constructed. Julius II moved against Cesare with the methodical, almost surgical precision of someone who had been planning this exact moment for years, perhaps even decades. He immediately revoked all of Cesare's military appointments, froze his substantial financial assets, and launched rigorous investigations into the dubious legal basis for his territorial conquests. More significantly, and with devastating strategic brilliance, he began meticulously building alliances with virtually every enemy that Cesare had accumulated during his ruthless years of expansion, effectively turning Cesare's own web of animosity against him. The sheer speed of Cesare's fall was breathtaking, a dizzying plunge from the heights of power. Within mere months of his father's death, the man who had been widely considered one of the most powerful and feared figures in all of Europe found himself utterly isolated, financially impoverished, and facing the very real threat of arrest and imprisonment. His carefully constructed network of allies evaporated like morning mist, as former supporters frantically rushed to accommodate the powerful new papal administration. Some of his recently conquered territories immediately declared their independence, seizing the opportunity. Others were swiftly reclaimed by their former rulers, now bolstered by explicit papal blessing. His once formidable military forces, unpaid and suddenly leaderless, began deserting en masse or shamelessly switching sides. The efficient administrative systems he had so innovatively created were systematically dismantled or ruthlessly reformed according to traditional, antiquated church practices. By early 1504, Cesare Borgia was no longer a major, or even minor, force in Italian politics. The revolutionary model of governance he had so audaciously pioneered was being systematically erased, as if it had never even existed. The audacious Borgia experiment in combining sacred religious authority with naked secular ambition appeared, to all outward observers, to have ended in complete and utter failure. Yet, the sprawling, tragic story of Cesare's fall was far more complex and nuanced than it initially appeared, and its profound implications would extend far beyond the immediate political consequences of his demise. The spectacular collapse of Cesare's power, though seemingly total, inadvertently revealed something profoundly significant about the intrinsic nature of Renaissance politics, a truth that would continue to influence European governance for centuries to come. While his numerous enemies gleefully celebrated what appeared to be the absolute, definitive destruction of Borgia influence, they fatally failed to recognize that Cesare, through his meteoric rise and devastating fall, had fundamentally and irrevocably altered the political landscape of Italy simply by proving, with horrifying clarity, that such rapid and radical transformation was, in fact, terrifyingly possible. The innovative methods he had so boldly pioneered did not, in fact, vanish with his dramatic fall from grace. Instead, they were assiduously studied, meticulously refined, and eventually, with a profound irony, adopted by the very rulers who had so vehemently opposed and feared him. His streamlined, merit-based administrative systems, designed for speed and accountability in his conquered territories, became coveted blueprints for other Italian princes seeking to modernize their own antiquated bureaucracies. His groundbreaking integration of diplomacy and military force, a seamless blend of cunning negotiation and brute strength, profoundly influenced how future leaders approached territorial expansion and the pursuit of power. Most significantly, his stark demonstration that competent, effective governance could genuinely generate popular loyalty and acceptance inspired an entire generation of rulers who finally understood, with newfound clarity, that practical effectiveness in leadership mattered far more than inherited birthright or ancient lineage. But perhaps the single most important and enduring legacy of Cesare's brief, tumultuous reign was the meticulous, detailed observations that Niccolò Machiavelli had diligently compiled during their various interactions. The astute Florentine diplomat had witnessed firsthand, with an almost scientific detachment, the entire cyclical arc of how power could be created, maintained, and ultimately lost through a series of calculated strategic decisions. He had seen, with his own eyes, how a brilliant, ruthless leader could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles through painstaking planning and unflinching, brutal execution. Yet, he had also critically observed how even the most successful and meticulously planned political project could utterly collapse if it depended too heavily on unpredictable circumstances entirely beyond its creator's control. These raw, unfiltered observations would eventually crystallize into The Prince, a monumental work that distilled the Borgia methods into a set of universal principles that could be applied across vastly different times and circumstances. Machiavelli's incisive analysis of Cesare's spectacular rise and equally spectacular fall would become one of the most influential political treatises ever written, ensuring that Borgia innovations, for better or worse, would continue to shape European politics long after the family itself had faded into obscurity. Meanwhile, Cesare himself was facing a stark, brutal reality that would have crushed a lesser man, though this ends the segment. The story continues after this point. Destroyed lesser men, lesser ambitions, and indeed, entire political landscape. By 1504, the tables had turned dramatically. Cesare, once the terror of Italy, found himself effectively a prisoner within the hallowed walls of the Vatican itself. His movements were meticulously restricted, his every communication scrutinized, his power utterly stripped. Pope Julius II, a man as cunning and ruthless as Cesare himself, had weighed his options. Killing Cesare would risk creating a martyr, potentially igniting further rebellion among those territories that still held a dangerous loyalty to the fallen duke. Instead, Julius chose a punishment far more insidious: political irrelevance, a slow suffocation of his very identity. Yet, this catastrophic reversal, this sudden plunge from absolute power to enforced idleness, did not break Cesare Borgia. On the contrary, it merely sharpened the strategic mind that had made him so formidable in his years of triumph. Rather than succumbing to despair or accepting his defeat, Cesare immediately began to plot what would become one of the most daring comeback attempts in the entire history of the Renaissance. His immediate, paramount objective was simple: escape papal custody. This he achieved not through brute force, but with the characteristic Borgia blend of bribery, intricate deception, and impeccable timing. In a breathtaking feat of subterfuge, in April 1504, while supposedly confined under the Pope's watchful eye, Cesare Borgia managed to vanish from Rome under the impenetrable cloak of darkness. His escape was so flawlessly executed, so utterly unexpected, that Pope Julius II, for all his spies and guards, remained blissfully unaware of his most dangerous prisoner's absence for several agonizing days. Cesare's immediate destination was Naples, a strategic haven where he desperately hoped to find sanctuary with Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, the formidable Spanish military commander, who held sway over the kingdom on behalf of Ferdinand of Aragon. This was no desperate, random flight. Cesare had cultivated extensive correspondence with influential Spanish officials throughout his meteoric rise, subtly positioning himself as an invaluable potential ally who possessed the unique insight and capability to advance Spanish interests across the fractured Italian peninsula. The Spanish response to Cesare's sudden, unexpected arrival was a masterclass in complex political calculation. King Ferdinand of Aragon, ever the pragmatist, recognized that Cesare still possessed a trove of invaluable intelligence concerning Italian politics, military capabilities, and the intricate web of alliances that defined the region. Cesare's intimate knowledge of fortifications, troop movements, and the true loyalties of various Italian city-states could prove exceptionally useful for Spain's own ambitious expansionist plans in the Mediterranean. Simultaneously, however, to openly harbor such a controversial, papally condemned figure carried immense diplomatic risks, potentially sparking an international incident with the Vatican. Ferdinand's solution was characteristically shrewd. He welcomed Cesare with outward cordiality, but kept him under an exceptionally close, suffocating surveillance, treating him as both an honored guest and a closely watched prisoner of state. This uneasy arrangement allowed the Spanish crown to extract the maximum benefit from Cesare's unparalleled expertise, all while meticulously avoiding the appearance of a direct, open challenge to the authority of the Pope. For nearly 2 years, Cesare remained in this precarious, ambiguous position, his formidable intellect advising Spanish commanders, even as his mind tirelessly churned, plotting his eventual, dramatic return to power. He meticulously maintained clandestine correspondence with his remaining supporters in his former territories, many of whom, astonishingly, had maintained a fierce loyalty despite his spectacular fall from grace. He devoured intelligence reports detailing political developments across Italy, endlessly searching for any chink in the armor of his enemies, any glimmer of instability or conflict he could exploit. Most critically, Cesare began to forge a new, radical strategic approach, one born from the harsh lessons of his earlier, catastrophic failures. His previous campaigns, he realized with chilling clarity, had been almost entirely dependent on unwavering papal support. This dependence had created a fatal, inherent vulnerability, exposed brutally when that support was so abruptly withdrawn. Any future attempt to reclaim his power, he concluded, would need to be built upon far more diversified, self-sustaining foundations. His long-awaited opportunity finally materialized in 1506. His brother-in-law, King John III of Navarre, a small, yet exquisitely strategically important realm nestled precariously between the titans of France and Spain, urgently requested military assistance. A virulent rebellion threatened to utterly destabilize his kingdom, and its internal conflicts held dangerous implications for the delicate balance of power across the broader European stage. Cesare saw this invitation not merely as a chance to fight, but as the perfect crucible to demonstrate his undiminished military genius, while simultaneously forging a new, independent power base, one wholly untethered from the fickle, treacherous currents of Italian politics. If he could successfully quell the Navarrese crisis, he would prove definitively to every leader in Europe that his earlier, breathtaking successes had been far more than mere products of papal favoritism. The campaign that was about to unfold would be Cesare Borgias' final, desperate attempt to reclaim his rightful place as one of Europe's premier military commanders. It would also be the ultimate test. Could the strategic brilliance that had made him a legend truly overcome the crushing, accumulated disadvantages of his catastrophic fall from power? The Navarrese campaign, in its initial phases, began with a promising surge of momentum for Cesare. His formidable reputation as a military innovator had, astonishingly, survived his political downfall, and many seasoned commanders were eager, even honored, to serve under a man who had so profoundly revolutionized Renaissance warfare. Within mere months of his arrival, Cesare had forged a formidable fighting force, a potent blend of disciplined Spanish regulars, seasoned Italian mercenaries, and loyal local troops pledged to King John. His initial operations were a chilling testament to his undiminished tactical acumen. His skills remained as sharp and incisive as ever. Cesare employed the very same devastating combination of rapid, unexpected movement, relentless intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare that had brought him such overwhelming success in his Italian campaigns. Rebel strongholds that had defiantly resisted royal forces for many months, often for over a year, now crumbled and fell to his precise, brutal attacks within mere weeks. However, the Navarrese campaign soon began to reveal how fundamentally the political and military landscape had shifted since Cesare Borgias' dazzling heyday. The rebels he was now confronting were not the isolated, provincial lords he had so easily dispatched in Italy. These were sophisticated, well-resourced opponents, secretly backed by the vast wealth of French gold and advised by astute French military experts, rendering them far more formidable adversaries than their sheer numbers might have initially suggested. More significantly, Cesare began to discern a chilling pattern. His earlier, legendary successes had now transformed him into a prized target for ambitious commanders, who saw defeating the fabled Borgia as a direct, undeniable path to their own advancement and glory. Enemy forces specifically sought out engagements with units under Cesare's direct command, driven by the fervent hope of claiming the ultimate credit for eliminating one of Europe's most feared military leaders. The final, tragic confrontation arrived on March 12, 1507, near the ancient town of Viana. Cesare, leading his advance units, was in relentless pursuit of a retreating enemy force when, through a tactical miscalculation or perhaps sheer eagerness, his leading elements became perilously separated from the main body of his army. Rather than exercising caution and waiting for crucial reinforcements to arrive, Cesare, driven by his inherent audacity and a lifetime of winning against the odds, chose to press the attack with only a small contingent of his most loyal and trusted soldiers. It was a decision that, in its very essence, encapsulated both his greatest strength and his fatal, inherent weakness. His willingness to take immense personal risks, to charge into the thick of battle alongside his men, had always inspired an almost fanatical loyalty among his troops, allowing him to seize and exploit fleeting opportunities that more cautious, conventional commanders would inevitably miss. But this same audacious spirit also meant that he occasionally acted with a dangerous impulsiveness, when painstaking, calculated deliberation would have been the far wiser course. The battle that ensued was agonizingly brief and utterly decisive. Cesare's small, brave force was swiftly and mercilessly surrounded by overwhelming numbers of enemy troops. Despite fighting with the same legendary courage, the same ferocious skill that had once made him invincible, he and his men were utterly overwhelmed and cut down in the chaotic, brutal melee. His body was discovered the following morning, stripped bare of its armor and weapons, a final indignity. It was so mutilated, so disfigured by the violence, that it was barely recognizable to those who had once cowered at the very mention of his name. News of Cesare Borgia's dramatic, ignominious death spread like wildfire throughout Europe, generating a maelstrom of reactions that unequivocally revealed how profoundly this single man had influenced, and indeed reshaped, Renaissance politics. His numerous enemies across the continent openly celebrated the elimination of a man they had universally viewed as a dangerous, anarchic revolutionary, a force of nature that threatened to upend the very fabric of their world. His former supporters, scattered and disenfranchised, mourned the profound loss of a leader who had, however briefly, shown them tantalizing possibilities of power and governance they had never dared to imagine. But perhaps the most enduring, most significant responses came from the era's foremost political theorists and military strategists, who recognized, with a chilling clarity, that they had just witnessed the abrupt, brutal conclusion of an era. Cesare's death marked the definitive end of the most audacious, most radical attempt to fundamentally revolutionize European governance since the very collapse of the mighty Roman Empire. The broader, far-reaching implications of his meteoric rise and catastrophic fall would continue to shape and influence political thought for generations, casting a long shadow over the continent. His groundbreaking demonstration that competent, ruthless governance could, in fact, generate fierce popular loyalty, would become a foundational inspiration for absolute monarchs across the continent for centuries to come. His pioneering integration of military innovation with intricate diplomatic strategy would rapidly become the standard practice, the absolute playbook for every successful ruler seeking to expand their dominion. His audacious willingness to abandon stifling traditional constraints and outdated moralities in the relentless pursuit of effective leadership would irrevocably shape the very mechanisms by which power was exercised across Europe. Most importantly, his deeply intellectual, often uncomfortable collaboration with Niccolò Machiavelli had produced profound insights into the very nature of political authority, insights that would remain chillingly relevant long after the specific, turbulent circumstances of Renaissance Italy had faded into history. The prince that Machiavelli so brilliantly described in his infamous treatise wasn't simply a thinly veiled portrait of Cesare Borgia, it was a revolutionary, universal model of leadership, a terrifyingly effective blueprint that could be adapted to vastly different times, places, and circumstances, a guide for any aspiring autocrat. Thus, while Cesare Borgia met his ignominious end in obscurity on a remote Spanish battlefield, far from the vibrant Italian territories where he had once seemed utterly invincible, his revolutionary ideas about governance, military strategy, and the true nature of political authority would continue to influence, to subtly manipulate, and to profoundly shape European development for centuries to come. The Borgia revolution in politics had indeed ended with the tragic death of its most brilliant, most audacious practitioner, but its profound, unsettling effects would prove far more durable, far more enduring, than anyone at the time could possibly have imagined. The story of Lucrezia Borgia presents perhaps the most complex, the most tragically misunderstood chapter in the family's controversial, often scandalous legacy. Unlike her formidable father and ruthless brother, whose ambitions were unequivocally political and military in their scope, Lucrezia's role in the sprawling Borgia saga was heartbreakingly shaped by the starkly limited options available to women, even women born into the most powerful, most aristocratic families in all of Renaissance Europe. From her earliest childhood, Lucrezia was viewed by her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother, Cesare, not as an individual with her own burgeoning desires, aspirations, or ambitions, but rather as a highly valuable diplomatic asset, a living chess piece whose strategic marriages could secure absolutely crucial political alliances for the Borgia dynasty. This instrumental, dehumanizing approach to her life was, regrettably, all too typical of how noble families of the era often utilized their daughters. However, the Borgias, in their relentless pursuit of power, elevated this practice to a dark art form, executing it with a cold precision that managed to shock even the jaded contemporary observers of their time. Her first marriage, painstakingly arranged when she was a mere 13 years old, was to Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro. This union was meticulously designed to cement Borgia influence with the immensely powerful Sforza family, who held absolute control over Milan and extensive, vital territories throughout northern Italy. But like so many Borgia arrangements, this marriage was purely transactional, a cold calculation of power, with little to no consideration given to the personal compatibility or, indeed, the happiness of the two young people involved. The marriage quickly devolved into a source of acute embarrassment and significant political complications for the ambitious Borgias. Giovanni Sforza proved to be a weak, unreliable ally, utterly incapable of delivering the political benefits and strategic advantages that Alexander and Cesare had so confidently expected. More problematically, he began to openly and vociferously criticize Borgia policies, actively distancing himself from their increasingly controversial and brutal actions. Pope Alexander's response was, in its essence, characteristically ruthless and cynically pragmatic. In 1497, he simply declared the marriage invalid, asserting, with astonishing audacity, that it had never been properly consummated. This swift, politically motivated annulment not only freed Lucrezia for a more politically advantageous remarriage, but also ignited a firestorm of scandalous rumors across Europe regarding the true, sordid reasons for the dissolution. Giovanni Sforza, utterly humiliated by the annulment and desperate to salvage his shattered reputation, retaliated by making accusations that would, chillingly, haunt the Borgia family name for centuries to come. He vehemently claimed that Alexander had dissolved the marriage not due to any legitimate political considerations, but because the Pope himself desired exclusive access to his own daughter. These horrifying incest allegations were, almost certainly, entirely false, motivated by Giovanni's searing desire for revenge and public humiliation rather than any factual basis. Yet, once uttered, they became an indelible, permanent stain on the Borgia name, forever woven into the dark, enduring mythology surrounding the family. These devastating accusations revealed something profoundly important about how the Borgias' enemies operated. Unable to defeat the Borgias through conventional political maneuvering or overt military confrontation, their opponents shrewdly resorted to the insidious weapons of character assassination and manufactured moral outrage. They understood, with chilling clarity, that scandal, particularly when it involved such egregious violations of the most fundamental social and religious taboos, could be far more damaging, far more destructive, than any military defeat or diplomatic setback. Lucrezia's second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, vividly demonstrated both the continued, critical importance of her diplomatic value and the increasingly perilous dangers associated with being connected, in any way, to the Borgias. Alfonso was carefully chosen because his powerful family connections could significantly strengthen papal influence in southern Italy, particularly in the strategically vital kingdom of Naples. Initially, this marriage appeared to be far more successful, far more promising, than Lucrezia's first ill-fated union. Alfonso was closer to her age, possessed a more personally appealing demeanor, and seemed genuinely more committed to making their relationship work. They soon had a son together, and contemporary accounts strongly suggest that Lucrezia, for the first time in her life, developed a genuine, tender affection for her second husband. But even this fragile happiness became an inevitable casualty of the broader, brutal political conflicts that relentlessly surrounded every single Borgia activity. As Cesare's aggressive military campaigns intensified across Italy, and papal policies became ever more audacious and predatory, Alfonso found himself agonizingly caught between a burgeoning loyalty to his wife's powerful family and the entrenched political interests of his own relatives. The situation quickly became utterly untenable when Cesare's relentless expansion directly threatened territories controlled by Alfonso's critical allies. The resolution of this agonizing conflict was, in classic Borgia style, swift and brutally decisive. In July 1500, Alfonso was ambushed and attacked by unknown assailants while taking a seemingly innocuous walk near the Vatican. He miraculously survived the initial assault, but was then brutally murdered in his bed several weeks later, almost certainly on Cesare's cold, calculating orders. The message delivered by this horrific act was chillingly clear. Not even marriage to Lucrezia Borgia could protect someone who dared to become an obstacle to the relentless, all-consuming Borgia ambitions. This brutal, senseless murder had profound and lasting effects on Lucrezia's psychology, forever altering her relationship with her family. She had genuinely cared for Alfonso, and his violent death made her acutely, painfully aware of how fundamentally her father and brother valued political advantage and dynastic power above all human relationships, above love, above even life itself. She began, with a painful clarity, to understand that her own survival, her own continued existence within this treacherous family, depended solely on her usefulness to their ambitions, rather than on any hope of being loved or protected by them. Her third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, represented both the absolute peak of her political value and, paradoxically, the true beginning of her remarkable transformation from a mere diplomatic pawn into an independent, formidable political actor in her own right. The Este family controlled one of the most sophisticated, most culturally rich courts in all of Italy, renowned throughout Europe for its lavish patronage of the arts and profound dedication to learning. This marriage, Lucrezia soon realized, would place her in an environment where she could finally develop her own burgeoning interests and formidable capabilities, rather than simply serving as a compliant instrument of cold Borgia policy. The arduous negotiations for this pivotal marriage revealed the extraordinary, almost desperate lengths to which Pope Alexander VI was willing to go to secure such an advantageous alliance for his family. The Pope provided an astronomical dowry, promised crucial military support for the Este family's territorial ambitions, and even, remarkably, agreed to legitimize several of Alfonso d'Este's illegitimate children. The terms were so overwhelmingly favorable to the Este family that they ultimately overcame their initial, deep-seated reluctance to associate with the notoriously scandalous Borgias. But perhaps most significantly, this marriage coincided precisely with Lucrezia's profound emergence as a political figure of considerable influence and stature. By 1501, she was no longer the naive teenage girl who had been callously married off to serve her father's diplomatic need. She was a sophisticated, resilient 21-year-old woman who had survived multiple, often traumatic, marriages, skillfully navigated the treacherous labyrinth of court politics, and learned, through bitter experience, how to fiercely protect her own interests in a cutthroat environment where personal loyalty was all too often ruthlessly subordinated to political advantage. Her arrival in Ferrara marked the true beginning of a remarkable, empowering transformation that would definitively define the final phase of her life and ultimately forge a legacy that was entirely separate, entirely distinct, from the swirling controversies and dark rumors that forever surrounded her father and her brother. The Borgias began their astonishing journey as relatively minor Spanish nobles, hailing from a largely forgotten town on the Iberian Peninsula. Yet, in the breathtaking span of just over a century, they had utterly revolutionized European politics, daringly redefined the traditional boundaries of papal authority, and, most importantly, created a chillingly effective template for power that would continue to influence governance for generations to come. Their story, raw and unvarnished, reveals something utterly fundamental about the boundless nature of human ambition and the inherent, often brutal, mechanics of authority itself. Were they monsters? Certainly, they were demonstrably capable of extraordinary brutality and shocking cruelty when it unequivocally served their purposes, when it advanced their insatiable climb to power. Were they corrupt? Absolutely. They treated the immense resources and the sacred spiritual authority of the Catholic Church as if it were their personal treasury, a bottomless well to fund their dynastic ambitions. Yet, for all their undeniable depravity, they were also undeniable visionaries, deeply perceptive individuals who understood, with a chilling foresight, that power in the emerging modern world would belong not to those who clung to outdated traditions, but to those who could adapt with lightning speed, innovate with audacious creativity, and execute their plans with ruthless, unyielding efficiency. The enduring Borgia legacy lives on, not in the fleeting territories they conquered or the vast wealth they so rapaciously accumulated, but rather in the revolutionary ideas they pioneered about truly effective leadership. Every single time a political leader seamlessly combines raw military force with cunning diplomatic strategy, every instance where someone masterfully weaponizes scandal as a potent instrument of statecraft, every moment a ruler ruthlessly prioritizes tangible results over conventional morality, they are, consciously or unconsciously, following a playbook that the Borgias meticulously wrote over 500 years ago. Now, here's what I want you to do. Look closely at the political leaders and power players operating today, whether they hold sway in government, dominate the world of business, or revolutionize the tech industry. Ask yourself, with an unblinking eye, which Borgia tactics are they so deftly employing? Who is the modern Cesare, tirelessly building power through sheer strategic brilliance and audacious risk-taking? And who, dare I ask, is playing the Alexander game, expertly manipulating vast institutions for the singular purpose of personal dynasty building and the advancement of their own kin? Drop your answers in the comments below, because I guarantee you, once you know what to look for, you will start seeing Borgia fingerprints absolutely everywhere. Next week, we're diving headfirst into a dynasty that makes the Borgias look like mere amateurs at the perilous game of survival, a family whose sheer longevity and scale of power are simply unmatched. I'm talking, of course, about the Romanovs, a family that ruled the largest empire on Earth for over 300 years, somehow surviving brutal palace coups, countless assassinations, and earth-shattering revolutions that would have utterly destroyed any other dynasty in history. Their epic story involves everything from Catherine the Great's brilliant, ruthless political maneuvering to Rasputin's mysterious, hypnotic influence over the last Tsar, and it all tragically culminates in one of history's most haunting, most devastating tragedies. You might think the Borgias were dramatic, but trust me, the Romanovs were operating on an entirely different scale of grandeur and despair. Subscribe now and turn on all notifications because this gripping series on history's most powerful dynasties is just getting started, and you won't want to miss a single pivotal moment. The game of power never truly ends. It merely evolves, growing more sophisticated, more nuanced, and infinitely more dangerous. And by the end of this series, you're about to become an undisputed expert at recognizing exactly how it's played, both then and now. If this story, this deep dive into the Borgia legacy, has fundamentally changed how you think about power or religion or indeed the very fabric of Renaissance history, then please hit that like button and share this with someone who desperately needs to understand that the real game has always been far deeper, far more complex, and infinitely more ruthless than what they taught us in school. The Borgias didn't just make history, they revealed eternal, unsettling truths about how power actually works. And those truths, chillingly, are more relevant today than ever before.